You know the one famous footprint. You know the one small step. But what about the contraband sandwich smuggled into orbit? The distinct smell of the moon? Or the fact that the astronauts' only life insurance was a stack of autographed photos? The real story, the interesting story, is always in the quiet, strange details. Let's start with the machine that got them there. Our first stop on this tour of cosmic trivia is the rocket itself, the Saturn V. And it's hard to talk about this thing without sounding a little ridiculous, because the scale of it is just fundamentally absurd. It remains, to this day, the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful rocket humanity has ever successfully flown. When it stood fully assembled on the launch pad, it was 111 meters, or 363 feet tall. That is taller than the Statue of Liberty. It was, for all intents and purposes, a 36-story skyscraper that had been told it had about 3 minutes to get to the edge of space, and it seemed to be in a very bad mood about it. The real heart of its power was in the first stage, the SIC. This section was powered by 5 colossal F1 engines. I want you to picture one of these engines. The nozzle, the bell at the bottom, was almost 4 meters wide. You could comfortably park a small car inside one of them. And the power generated was biblical. A single F1 engine produced more thrust than all 3 of the space shuttle's main engines combined, and the Saturn V had 5 of them. At liftoff, these engines generated over 7.6 million pounds of thrust. This is more power than all the hydroelectric dams in North America combined, focused into a single violent point. The launch wasn't just loud. It was a physical event that bordered on being a geological one.
The sound produced by these 5 F1 engines is something that is difficult to describe. People who witnessed the launches from the press site several miles away reported that it wasn't something you just heard with your ears. It was a physical pressure wave that hit you in the chest, a deep, crackling roar so intense it felt like the air itself was being torn apart. The vibrations shook the ground, rattled windows in towns dozens of miles away, and could even be detected on seismographs designed to measure earthquakes. To prevent this immense acoustic energy from literally shaking the rocket to pieces on the launch pad, NASA had to invent one of the world's most powerful sprinkler systems. This was the sound suppression system. In the final seconds before ignition, a colossal amount of water, about 300,000 gallons, enough to fill a large swimming pool, was dumped onto the launch platform. The water would absorb the acoustic energy of the launch, turning it into massive clouds of steam. It was a strange, beautiful, and absolutely necessary piece of engineering, a man-made waterfall to tame a man-made volcano. And what was this volcano burning? The Saturn V was a 3-stage rocket, and its first stage was a voracious beast. It was burning a combination of RP-1, which is a highly refined form of kerosene, much like jet fuel, and liquid oxygen, or LOX, as the oxidizer. In the first 2.5 minutes of flight, those 5 F1 engines would burn through over 2,000 tons of propellant. That's a fuel consumption rate of about 20 tons of fuel per second. It's a number that just doesn't compute in human terms. It was the most powerful and the most thirsty machine ever built, a testament to the brute force required to escape our planet's deep gravity well.
Now let's move from the brute force of the rocket to the quiet, subtle genius of its brain. This brings us to the Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC. If the Saturn V was a giant of muscle and fire, the AGC was a tiny, meticulous brain, and in its own way, it's just as impressive. In an age where we all carry phones with more computing power than all of NASA had in the 1960s, it's almost impossible to appreciate what a marvel this little machine was. The AGC was one of the very first computers ever to use a revolutionary new technology called integrated circuits. Before this, computers were made of thousands of individual transistors and components, making them huge and unreliable. The integrated circuit, which put multiple transistors onto a single silicon chip, was the key to making the computer small enough and rugged enough to fly to the moon. It was a true pioneer of the digital age. But let's talk about its specs, because this is where it gets fun. The AGC had only 2 kilobytes of RAM. That's the working memory it uses for active calculations. Not gigabytes, not megabytes, but 2 kilobytes. That is roughly enough memory to store about half a page of plain text. For its permanent memory, the programs that contained all the complex instructions for navigating to the moon, it had just 36 kilobytes of storage. Your phone's operating system takes up millions of times more space than the entire program that guided humanity to another world. The astronauts literally had more computing power in their digital watches than in their spaceship. And the way this permanent memory was stored is one of my favorite obscure facts. It wasn't on a hard drive or a flash chip. It was physically woven by hand.
This handmade memory was called core rope memory. It worked a bit like a tiny, complex tapestry. It consisted of a series of copper wires that were either woven through a tiny magnetic core or around it. If the wire went through the core, it represented a digital 1. If it went around the core, it represented a 0. The entire flight software was translated into this binary code, and then a team of skilled women, mostly former textile workers, would sit at special looms and physically weave the programs wire by wire. It was an incredibly intricate and unforgiving process. A single mistake in the weaving would mean the entire module of memory had to be thrown out and started again. The software had to be absolutely perfect, completely debugged and finalized months before launch, because once it was woven, it was permanent. The astronauts called this type of memory LOL memory, which stood for Little Old Ladies, in an affectionate tribute to the women who so carefully wove their digital lifeline. It's a beautiful and quiet piece of history, a reminder that the digital revolution was built not just on silicon, but on the meticulous, handcrafted skill of the textile industry. The software itself was a masterpiece of efficiency, led by a brilliant MIT computer scientist named Margaret Hamilton. She and her team had to invent the very principles of modern reliable software as they went. One of their most important innovations was the idea of priority scheduling. They programmed the AGC to understand that some tasks were more important than others. If the computer ever got overloaded with too many requests, it was designed to automatically drop the low-priority tasks and focus all its limited processing power on the critical ones, like steering the engines or firing the thrusters. This obscure, forward-thinking piece of software design would, as we'll see, famously save the entire lunar landing from being aborted at the last minute.
From the brains of the machine, let's now turn to its skin. Our next topic is the Apollo A7L spacesuit, the iconic white suit that we all picture when we think of a moonwalker. This wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a personalized, wearable spacecraft, one of the most complex and intimate machines ever made. The suit was composed of 21 distinct layers of different materials, each with a specific purpose. It had to protect the astronaut from the vacuum of space, from the extreme temperatures, from micrometeoroid impacts, and from solar radiation, all while being flexible enough for them to actually move around and do their work. The innermost layers were the most interesting. Directly against their skin, the astronauts wore a liquid cooling garment. This was essentially a full-body set of long underwear, but with a network of thin plastic tubes woven into it.
Cool water was constantly pumped through these tubes, drawing heat away from the astronaut's body and carrying it to the backpack life support system where it was radiated away into space. Without this personal cooling system, the heat generated by an astronaut's own body during a strenuous moonwalk would have quickly overwhelmed them. Over this came a series of pressure-retaining layers, a bladder made of neoprene-coated nylon, designed to hold the pure oxygen atmosphere that the astronaut breathed. And over that were multiple layers of super-thin aluminized mylar and other materials, which acted like the insulation in a thermos, reflecting heat. The outer layers were made of a special, tough fabric called beta cloth, which was fireproof and Teflon-coated fabric to protect against abrasion. The entire suit was a masterpiece of material science and textile engineering. And the company that led the team that built these incredible life-saving suits? It was Playtex, a company that was primarily famous for making bras and girdles for women. NASA held a competition for the suit contract, and Playtex, with their decades of experience in sewing complex, flexible, rubberized garments, beat out the traditional military and aerospace contractors. It's another one of those quiet, surprising footnotes of history.
The cost of these handmade, custom-fitted suits was astronomical. In the 1960s, each suit cost an estimated $100,000. In today's money, that's well over $500,000 per suit. They were, pound for pound, one of the most expensive and complex machines of the entire Apollo program. Now, let's move from the machines to the men who flew them. For all the incredible technology, the Apollo program was, at its heart, a human story. Let's explore some of the more obscure and personal facts about the astronauts themselves, the quiet details that made them more than just heroes in a spacesuit. Our next fact concerns the commander of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong. We think of the astronauts as military men, and most of them were. They were test pilots from the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. But Neil Armstrong, at the time of his historic mission, was a civilian. He had been a naval aviator during the Korean War, but he had left the military to become a civilian test pilot for NASA's predecessor. When NASA was formed, he joined the astronaut corps as one of the first civilians. This made him the first non-military person to command a major American space mission, and the first civilian to walk on the moon. His quiet, professional, engineering-focused mindset was seen as a perfect fit for the immense historical pressure of that first landing. His crewmate, Buzz Aldrin, had a different but equally impressive background. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a brilliant academic. He had earned a doctorate in astronautics from MIT, and his doctoral thesis, written years before the Apollo program was even finalized, was on the subject of manned orbital rendezvous. He had literally written the book on the complex techniques that would be needed for the lunar module to meet and dock with the command module in lunar orbit. This academic rigor made him an essential part of the crew, but his more outspoken and sometimes complicated personality was one of the reasons Armstrong was chosen for that first step.
And then there was Michael Collins, the command module pilot, the man who would orbit the moon alone while his crewmates walked on its surface. He was known for his sharp wit and his eloquent, almost poetic way of looking at the mission. He never felt like the loneliest man, as the press often called him. In his memoirs, he wrote that he felt privileged to be there and that he was an integral part of the team. He was the crew's lifeline, their only ride home. His quiet, competent professionalism was just as vital to the mission's success as the moonwalk itself. Now for a truly strange and poignant fact about astronaut life. This is the story of their life insurance. In the 1960s, the job of an astronaut was so incredibly dangerous that they could not get life insurance at a reasonable rate. The risk was simply too high. But these men had families, and they wanted to provide for them in case they didn't return. So the Apollo crews came up with a clever, if slightly morbid, solution. In the weeks before their launch, during their pre-flight quarantine period, the astronauts would sit down and sign hundreds of postal covers, envelopes stamped with mission-related artwork. They knew that these autographs would be incredibly valuable if they did not return from the mission. They would give these stacks of signed envelopes to a trusted friend with the instruction that, if the mission ended in disaster, the friend was to give the envelopes to their families. The families could then sell these rare insurance covers to collectors to provide some financial support. It is a quiet, powerful, and deeply moving reminder of the immense personal risks these men were taking, and the quiet, practical ways they prepared for the worst. It was a life insurance policy paid for not with money, but with fame and legacy.
Now let's turn to a more light-hearted but equally human aspect of life on these missions. Let's talk about the food. We've done a whole deep dive into this before, so we'll just visit a few of the most interesting and obscure culinary facts from the Apollo era. As we know, the food was a mix of rehydratable meals and bite-sized cubes. But what was the first meal ever eaten on the surface of the moon? After the tense landing of the Eagle, the flight plan called for a meal before the moonwalk. The official NASA records show that the meal consisted of bacon squares, peaches, sugar cookie cubes, and coffee. Imagine that, the first explorers on another world having a quiet meal of processed bacon and cookies before stepping out into the magnificent desolation. But as we've learned, there was also an unofficial first meal. Buzz Aldrin, a church elder, had brought with him a small communion kit. In a quiet, private moment, he consumed a small wafer of bread and a sip of wine, performing the first and only Christian sacrament on another celestial body. So, depending on your definition, the first food eaten on the moon was either bacon squares or communion bread. Another famous food story is the surprising popularity of the shrimp cocktail. Of all the freeze-dried options available, this was a consistent favorite among almost all the astronauts. Why? Because of the famously spicy horseradish cocktail sauce. As we know, the fluid shift in an astronaut's head dulls their sense of taste and smell. The fiery kick of the horseradish was one of the few flavor sensations that could cut through that blandness. It was a welcome jolt to the senses, a small moment of intense flavor in an otherwise muted culinary world. And what about the least popular foods? While most of the food was tolerable, there were a few duds. Many astronauts complained about the freeze-dried scrambled eggs, which they said had a strange texture. But the most famously disliked item was probably the bacon squares. While some enjoyed them, others found them to be greasy, hard, and generally unappetizing. They were a perfect example of a food that was engineered for safety and convenience, but had lost something essential in the process.
Finally, there's the story of Tang, the orange-flavored breakfast drink. It has become so intertwined with the story of the space program that many people believe NASA invented it. This is a myth. Tang was actually invented by the General Foods Corporation in 1957. It was not a commercial success at first, but in the mid-1960s, NASA, looking for a familiar, vitamin-fortified drink powder for the Gemini missions, tested it and decided to use it. The fact that astronauts were drinking Tang was a huge marketing coup for the company, and its sales on Earth skyrocketed. It's a quiet example of how the space program could have a massive and sometimes accidental impact on popular culture back home. With the crew fed and prepared, let's now turn to the journey itself. The trip from the Earth to the Moon is a quiet, 3-day coast through the void, but it is not an idle journey. It is a period of constant system checks, navigation, and a few strange and beautiful procedures. One of the most visually interesting of these is the barbecue roll, which is more formally known as passive thermal control, or PTC. A spacecraft traveling in deep space is subject to the same temperature extremes we discussed earlier. The side facing the sun gets incredibly hot, while the side facing away gets incredibly cold. To prevent one side from overheating and the other from having its components freeze, the spacecraft has to be put into a slow, continuous roll along its long axis. It rotates at a rate of about 3 revolutions per hour, slowly and constantly turning like a chicken on a spit. This barbecue roll ensures that the entire spacecraft is evenly heated by the sun, maintaining a stable internal temperature. For the astronauts inside, it created a slow, gentle, and continuous rotation of the view outside their windows, with the sun, the Earth, and the Moon slowly passing by over and over again.
Another critical and rather daring maneuver that had to be performed early in the journey was the transposition and docking. When the Saturn V launched, the lunar module, the Eagle, was tucked away in a special compartment at the top of the rocket's 3rd stage, just behind the main command and service module where the astronauts were. To get it out, they had to perform a complex orbital ballet. After the 3rd stage engine had fired to send them on their way to the Moon, the command and service module, or CSM, had to separate from the rocket stage. The astronauts would then use their thrusters to pull away, turn their entire spacecraft around 180 degrees, and then fly back towards the now exposed lunar module. They would then have to perform a delicate docking maneuver, latching the nose of their command module onto the top of the Eagle. Once securely docked, explosive bolts would fire to separate the lunar module from the rocket stage, and the astronauts could then gently pull it away. They were, in effect, performing a space rescue of their own lander. This was a mission-critical maneuver that had to be performed manually, hundreds of thousands of kilometers from home. During this long, quiet coast, the astronauts also experienced that profound, life-changing shift in perspective as they watched their home planet shrink behind them. This is the overview effect. The Earth transformed from being the ground beneath their feet into a tangible, finite object, a beautiful and fragile-looking blue and white marble hanging alone in the vast black emptiness. Almost every astronaut who has seen this view has reported that it was a deeply moving, almost spiritual experience. It can create a powerful cognitive shift, a sudden awareness of the interconnectedness of all life on Earth and the foolishness of our terrestrial conflicts. It is perhaps the most significant, if unofficial, scientific finding of the entire Apollo program.
After 3 days of this quiet, watchful journey, the crew of Apollo 11 arrived in lunar orbit. Now began the most complex, most dangerous, and most historic part of their mission, the descent to the surface. Let's now take a slow, detailed look at the quiet facts of the landing. The first interesting detail is the name of the lander itself. The crew was allowed to choose the call signs for their 2 spacecraft. For the command module, which would carry them all home, they chose Columbia, a historic name for America itself. For the fragile, spindly lunar module that would take them down to the surface, they chose the call sign Eagle, after the bald eagle on the mission's insignia. This majestic name would soon be broadcast to every corner of the globe. As the Eagle descended, we know that the crew was hit with the famous 1202 computer alarms. We've talked about how the computer was overloaded, but was smart enough to keep working on the important tasks. But what was causing the overload? The problem was the rendezvous radar, the system designed to track the command module in orbit.
The checklist had instructed the astronauts to turn this system on during the descent, just in case they had to perform an emergency abort and rendezvous quickly with Columbia. However, a small hardware bug meant that the radar was feeding a constant stream of unnecessary data to the computer, which was already working at its maximum capacity to fly the landing. It was this extra, unexpected data that caused the overload alarms. It was a small, quiet, and almost disastrous hardware quirk that was overcome by brilliant software design. And that brings us to the landing itself. As Neil Armstrong looked out his small window, he realized the autopilot was taking them down into a dangerous spot, a crater filled with large boulders. So he took semi-manual control. This meant he could control the lander's horizontal movement while the computer controlled the rate of descent.
This manual piloting, flying the lunar module like a celestial helicopter, was eating up a huge amount of their precious descent fuel. The LM was a creature of pure efficiency, built with incredibly tight margins. It had just enough fuel to land and not much more. In mission control in Houston, the flight controllers watched their telemetry with quiet, focused intensity. The voice of the capsule communicator, or Capcom, became a steady, rhythmic countdown in the astronauts' ears, not of time, but of remaining fuel. 60 seconds, the call came up from Houston, meaning they had only 1 minute of hovering time left before they would hit a critical point where they would have to abort the landing and fire their Ascent Engine to get back to orbit. Armstrong, his heart rate soaring, but his voice perfectly calm, continued to guide the Eagle forward, his eyes scanning the gray, cratered landscape for a safe, flat spot. 30 seconds came the call from the ground. The tension in mission control was almost unbearable, but the communication loop remained professional and serene. Armstrong was now just a few dozen feet above the surface, his view increasingly obscured by the dust being kicked up by his own engine. He was flying blind, relying on the lander's shadow and the instrument readouts being called out by Aldrin. With an estimated 25 seconds of fuel remaining, he found his spot. He gently, carefully set the Eagle down. As one of the long probes extending from the lander's feet touched the surface, a blue light flashed on the control panel. Aldrin's voice came through, clear and professional. Contact light. Armstrong then performed the final sequence to shut down the descent engine. There was a moment of profound, perfect silence. Then Armstrong's calm voice was broadcast to the more than 500 million people listening back on Earth. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. The relief in mission control was explosive, a wave of cheers and tears from a team that had just guided 2 humans to the surface of another world.
Another unexpected challenge that Armstrong faced in those final moments of landing was the dust. The surface of the moon is covered in a fine, powdery layer of soil called regolith, created by billions of years of micrometeoroid impacts shattering the surface rock. As the powerful descent engine of the Eagle got close to the ground, it blasted this fine dust outwards at high speed. But because there is no atmosphere on the moon, the dust didn't behave like it would on Earth. It didn't form a swirling, turbulent cloud of brown smoke. Instead, it shot out in perfect straight lines, like laser beams, along the lunar surface. From inside the cockpit, Armstrong described it as a transparent sheet of dust moving radially outwards from the landing site. This sheet of fast-moving dust completely obscured his view of the ground below him in the final, most critical moments of the descent. He could no longer see the craters or the rocks he was trying to avoid. So how did he land? He had to rely on a few clever tricks.
One was to look for the shadow of the lunar module itself projected onto the dusty haze below. By watching the shadow, he could get a sense of his altitude and horizontal speed. He also relied completely on the data being called out by Buzz Aldrin, who was monitoring the instruments that gave them their altitude and descent rate. So, the very first landing on another world was, in its final seconds, effectively an instrument landing, a quiet act of trust between a pilot, his crewmate, and their machine, performed while flying blind through a self-generated storm of lunar dust. It's another quiet, incredible detail that is often lost in the grandeur of the story.
After the Eagle had landed, and after the initial tense period of checking all the systems and preparing the lander for a potential emergency launch, the original flight plan called for the astronauts to have a 5-hour sleep period. They had been awake for a very long time, and the descent had been incredibly taxing, but they were on the moon. They were sitting on the surface of another world. The idea of going to sleep was, to them, completely absurd. They were buzzing with adrenaline and excitement. They made a call to Mission Control and argued their case. They felt fine, they were not tired, and they wanted to get on with the main event, the moonwalk, or EVA, extravehicular activity. After some discussion, Houston agreed. The sleep period was pushed to after the EVA, and so Armstrong and Aldrin began the long and surprisingly difficult process of getting into their bulky spacesuits and preparing to open the hatch. This process took over 2 hours. The inside of the lunar module was incredibly cramped, and the two men, already in their flight suits, now had to don the full A7L spacesuit, complete with its life support backpack, helmet, and gloves. It was an awkward and difficult gymnastic exercise in a tiny, cluttered space. Finally, after all the checks were complete, they depressurized the cabin, letting all the air out into the vacuum. At last, the moment came. The hatch was opened. Neil Armstrong, moving slowly and carefully, backed out of the small triangular opening and onto the small platform at the top of the ladder, which they called the porch. He pulled a cord, activating a camera mounted on the lander, which began broadcasting a grainy, ghostly black and white image to a rapt world. He then began his slow descent down the 9-rung ladder. And then he took that famous first step. But what was the very first scientific act performed on the moon? Before the flag, before the experiments, Armstrong performed a quiet but critical task. He used a small tool to scoop up a small contingency sample of lunar soil and rocks, which he then placed in a pocket on his leg. The reason for this was simple. If something went wrong and they had to leave the moon in a hurry, this simple act ensured that, no matter what, they would have a piece of the moon to bring back to the scientists on Earth.
After Armstrong had taken his first historic steps and collected the contingency sample, it was Buzz Aldrin's turn. He emerged from the Eagle and made his way down the ladder, joining his commander on the surface. As he stepped off the ladder, his first words were not a prepared historical statement, but a simple, heartfelt, and beautiful description of what he saw. He called it magnificent desolation. It's a wonderful, poetic phrase that perfectly captures the strange, barren, and beautiful reality of the lunar landscape. As the two men began to move around, they had to adapt to the strange new physics of the moon's gravity, which is only 1/6 as strong as Earth's. They described a kind of slow-motion, bounding gait as being the most efficient way to move around. And with every step, their boots kicked up the fine, powdery lunar dust. This dust, or regolith, was one of the biggest surprises of the mission. It was a very fine powder, almost like talc or flour, but it was also incredibly abrasive and clinging. And it had a smell. This is one of my favorite obscure facts. When the astronauts got back inside the lunar module after their moonwalk, they brought a lot of this fine dust back with them on their suits. As the cabin was repressurized with oxygen, they noticed a very distinct and peculiar odor. They all described it in similar terms. It was a sharp, pungent smell, like spent gunpowder after a firecracker has gone off, or the smell of wet ashes in a fireplace. It was the scent of ancient, sterile rock that had never been exposed to air or moisture. It was, quite literally, the smell of another world. This moon dust would later prove to be a problem, as all 12 men who walked on the moon reported some level of lunar hay fever, a mild allergic reaction to the sharp, irritating dust in their eyes and lungs.
One of the most iconic moments of the moonwalk was the planting of the American flag. This symbolic act was a top priority for the mission, but it turned out to be surprisingly difficult. The lunar soil, which looked soft, was actually very hard and compacted just beneath the surface. Armstrong and Aldrin struggled to push the flagpole deep enough into the ground to make it stand securely. They only managed to get it in by about 7 or 8 inches. They were worried it might fall over on live television, which would have been a bit embarrassing. And this leads to the famous waving flag controversy. As we've already discussed, the flag appears to ripple in the video footage, which many people have pointed to as proof of a hoax, arguing that it must have been blowing in a breeze. But the quiet truth is twofold. First, the flag was hung from a special L-shaped pole with a horizontal bar extending from the top to make it fly open in the airless environment. The astronauts had trouble extending this horizontal bar all the way, which caused the nylon flag to be bunched up and wrinkled, giving it the appearance of being rippled by the wind. Second, the waving motion was simply the result of the astronauts twisting and turning the pole as they struggled to plant it in the hard ground. All that energy was transferred to the flexible flag, causing it to ripple back and forth. Because there is no air on the moon to create friction and dampen the motion, the flag continued to sway for quite a while after they let it go. So, the waving flag is not evidence of a secret movie set. It is perfect evidence of the laws of physics operating in a vacuum. A final, quiet, ironic footnote to this story is that Buzz Aldrin reported seeing the flag get knocked over by the blast from the Ascent Engine when they took off from the moon.
After planting the flag, the astronauts got to work on their main scientific tasks. They deployed a set of experiments called the Early Apollo Scientific Experiments Package, or EASPEP. This was a small, portable suite of instruments designed to give us our first data from the surface of another world. The package was powered by a small set of solar panels. One of the key experiments was the passive seismic experiment. This was a sensitive seismometer designed to listen for moonquakes and meteorite impacts. The astronauts placed it on the surface, and it began sending back data about the moon's interior structure. It was so sensitive, it could even pick up the tiny vibrations of the astronauts' own footsteps on the surface nearby. This experiment, and the more advanced ones left by later Apollo missions, completely revolutionized our understanding of the moon's geology, revealing that it has a small, dense core, much like the Earth. Another experiment was the solar wind composition experiment. This was a beautifully simple device. It was essentially just a sheet of ultra-pure aluminum foil, about 1 meter long, that they unrolled and stuck in the ground facing the sun. The idea was to capture particles from the solar wind, the constant stream of particles flowing from the sun directly. After being exposed for the duration of the moonwalk, the foil was rolled back up and brought back to Earth. In the lab, scientists could then analyze the particles that had embedded themselves in the foil, giving us our first direct sample of the material that makes up our sun. But perhaps the most important and long-lasting experiment they deployed was the laser-ranging retroreflector. This is the single experiment from the Apollo missions that is still in active use today, over 50 years later. It is one of the most elegant and powerful proofs that we actually went to the moon.
The Laser Ranging Retroreflector, or LRRR, is not a normal mirror. It is a sophisticated array of 100 corner cube prisms made of high-quality fused silica. A corner cube prism has the unique optical property of reflecting any light that enters it directly back along the exact same path it came from. So if you shine a laser beam at it, the beam will bounce off and come straight back to you. The Apollo 11, 14, and 15 crews all deployed these reflector arrays on the lunar surface, and to this day, observatories on Earth like the McDonald Observatory in Texas and the Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico routinely aim powerful, giant laser beams at these small, suitcase-sized targets. The laser pulse travels for about 1.3 seconds to the moon, hits the reflector, and then a tiny fraction of that light, perhaps only a single photon from the entire pulse, makes the 1.3-second journey back to the telescope on Earth, where it is picked up by incredibly sensitive detectors. By precisely timing this 2.6-second round trip, scientists can measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon with an astonishing, almost unbelievable level of precision, down to a few millimeters. This ongoing experiment has provided a wealth of incredible scientific data. It has allowed us to map the Moon's orbit with unprecedented accuracy. It has shown us that the Moon is very slowly drifting away from the Earth at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year. And it has even been used to test Einstein's theory of general relativity with incredible precision. It is a quiet, beautiful, and enduring legacy of the Apollo program, a scientific conversation with the Moon that continues to this day. Beyond the science and the symbolism, the moonwalk was also a very human event. This brings us to the quiet, often forgotten details of what was left behind on the surface of the Moon. To save weight for the critical ascent back to orbit, the astronauts were instructed to leave behind anything that wasn't essential. This included not just their scientific instruments, but also a collection of personal and memorial items. On the leg of the Eagle's descent stage, which still sits on the Moon today, is a small plaque. On it are images of the two hemispheres of Earth, the signatures of the 3 astronauts and President Nixon, and a simple, powerful inscription that reads, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the Moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It is a quiet, simple statement of purpose for the entire mission. The crew also left behind a small silicon disc about the size of a $50 coin. On this disc were microscopically inscribed messages of goodwill from the leaders of 73 different countries from around the world. It was a gesture of global unity, a collection of peaceful messages carried to another world. But the most poignant items left behind were the memorials. The Apollo 11 crew left a mission patch commemorating the crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, who had tragically died in a launch pad fire in 1967. They also left 2 medals honoring Soviet cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov, who had also died in the line of duty. It was a quiet tribute to the fact that the quest for space was a dangerous endeavor that had claimed heroes on both sides of the space race. On a later mission, Apollo 16, astronaut Charles Duke famously left a small, plastic-wrapped photograph of himself, his wife, and their 2 sons sitting on the lunar dust. A quiet,
personal family portrait left on another world. In the middle of all this work, another historic and somewhat surreal event occurred. The astronauts received a phone call. It was from the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, speaking to them from the Oval Office in the White House. It was, and still is, the longest distance phone call ever made in human history. Nixon's voice was patched through mission control in Houston, up to the antennas in space, and into the headsets of Armstrong and Aldrin as they stood on the lunar surface. He congratulated them on their historic achievement, calling it the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. It was a slightly awkward but deeply symbolic moment, a brief conversation across 250,000 miles of empty space. After about 2.5 hours on the surface, the moonwalk came to an end. Armstrong and Aldrin packed up their precious boxes of moon rocks and film, climbed back up the ladder, and sealed themselves back inside the Eagle. They had successfully completed all of their objectives. Their home was now a tiny cabin filled with the sharp, gunpowder-like smell of the lunar dust that had clung to their suits. They pressurized the cabin, took off their bulky suits, and prepared for their scheduled sleep period, the one they had postponed earlier. It was, reportedly, not a very restful sleep. The cabin was cold, they were still buzzing with adrenaline, and it was difficult to find a comfortable position. Armstrong rigged up a small hammock, while Aldrin curled up on the floor of the lander. While all of this incredible history was being made on the surface, we mustn't forget the third member of the crew. High above, in lunar orbit, Michael Collins was having his own very different but equally profound and historic experience. He was, for a time, the loneliest human being in the entire universe.
While Armstrong and Aldrin were making their historic footprints in the lunar dust, Michael Collins was carving his own lonely path through the sky above. His role as the command module pilot was one of immense responsibility and quiet pressure. He was not just waiting, he was actively flying a complex spacecraft, and he was the crew's only ticket home. During his solo orbits, Collins was one of the busiest men on the mission. He had his own thick book of flight plans and procedures to follow. He had to keep the command module, Columbia, in a stable, predictable orbit. He was constantly tracking the location of the Eagle on the surface, making sure he knew exactly where his crewmates were. He was in regular communication with mission control in Houston, relaying information and receiving updates. And he was meticulously preparing Columbia for the most critical part of his job yet to come, the rendezvous and docking with the Eagle when it returned from the surface. If that maneuver failed, the mission would be a catastrophic failure. He was, in every sense, the lifeline. He later wrote that he felt a deep sense of connection to the two men on the surface, a feeling of being a third part of a single, functioning organism. But there was a part of his journey that was defined by a profound and absolute solitude. For 48 minutes of every 2-hour orbit, as Columbia passed over the far side of the moon, he was completely and utterly cut off from all of humanity. The immense, rocky body of the moon itself blocked all radio signals to and from Earth. He could not talk to Houston. He could not hear the chatter from Tranquility Base. He was alone, more alone than any human had ever been before. Many people have imagined this part of his journey as being terrifying, a period of deep loneliness and fear. But Michael Collins, in his own eloquent writings, described the experience very differently. He said he did not feel lonely. In fact, he felt a sense of profound peace, of quiet exultation. He was the sole occupant of his own tiny worldlet, hurtling through the cosmos. He described the silence as being perfect and absolute, a quiet that was deeper than any he had ever known on Earth. He was also one of the few humans to ever see the far side of the moon with his own eyes. He described it as a rugged, ancient, and utterly alien landscape, even more cratered and battered than the near side.
He felt a sense of privilege to be the sole human witness to this hidden face of our celestial neighbor. He wrote later that he was keenly aware that if a critical failure happened on the far side, he would die alone, and no one would even know about it until his ship failed to re-emerge. But he said this thought didn't frighten him. It was just a quiet, accepted reality of his unique position. His solo journey around the moon was not a story of fear, but one of quiet contemplation, of a man completely at peace with his incredible and incredibly lonely task. And what about the strange space music that the Apollo 10 crew had heard on their dress rehearsal mission? Collins, who was also the command module pilot on that mission, was very familiar with the sound. He knew that as soon as he flew behind the moon, the eerie whooshing sounds would start up in his headset. But now he knew the cause. The strange sounds were not alien signals, but simply radio interference between the VHF radios of the command module and the lunar module when they were close together. On his solo orbits, with the Eagle now far away on the surface, there was no music. There was only the quiet hiss of his own spacecraft and the perfect, profound silence of the universe outside his window.
One of the quiet, grim realities of his vigil was a procedure that, thankfully, he never had to use. In the flight plan, there was a small, sad-looking section that detailed what he should do if Armstrong and Aldrin were unable to lift off from the moon. If the Eagle's Ascent Engine failed, there was absolutely no way to rescue them. They would be stranded on the moon forever. In that event, Collins would have had to perform the heartbreaking task of leaving his crewmates behind and beginning the long, lonely journey back to Earth by himself. Back on Earth, another secret and somber preparation had been made. President Nixon had a speech prepared, written by William Safire, to be delivered to the nation in the event of a lunar disaster. It began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." It is a beautifully written and deeply moving piece of prose, a quiet testament to the immense risks that everyone involved knew they were taking. The existence of this speech, hidden away in a presidential drawer, is a powerful reminder of the fine line between triumph and tragedy that the Apollo missions walked. Thankfully, none of these grim contingencies were needed. After their short, restless sleep, Armstrong and Aldrin awoke and began the long process of preparing the Eagle for liftoff. They jettisoned everything they didn't need to save weight for the ascent. This included their life support backpacks, their lunar boots, their cameras, and various tools. All of this equipment and the American flag that was knocked over still sits on the surface of Tranquility Base today, a quiet, motionless monument to humanity's first visit. Then came the most critical moment of the return journey, firing the Ascent Engine.
The design of the lunar module's Ascent Engine is a story of quiet, terrifying simplicity. For almost every other critical system on the Apollo spacecraft, there was a backup, a redundancy. But the Ascent Engine was different. It had to be as simple and as lightweight as possible. It had no backup. There was only one engine and one set of fuel tanks. It had to fire perfectly, exactly on time, or it wouldn't work at all. It had been built with incredible care and tested relentlessly on the ground, but it had never been fired in the vacuum of space before. The lives of Armstrong and Aldrin depended entirely on this one single engine working perfectly, just once. Inside the cabin, the astronauts went through their checklist. They performed the famous low-tech repair on the broken circuit breaker switch, using a felt-tip pen to push it in and arm the engine. The countdown reached 0. They fired the engine. And it worked. It worked perfectly. The ascent stage of the Eagle lifted smoothly off the lunar surface, using its larger descent stage as a launch pad. They were on their way back to orbit. From his vantage point high above, Michael Collins was anxiously waiting. He described searching the gray landscape below for any sign of his crewmates, and then he saw it. He described it as a tiny, bright spark, a little glint of light rising up from the surface. He had found them. "I've got you," he calmly radioed down. The two spacecraft were now in the same orbit, but they were still many kilometers apart. Now began the delicate, celestial ballet of rendezvous and docking. It was a complex series of maneuvers, all performed manually by the two crews, that would have to bring them together for the final link-up, their ticket home.
The rendezvous in lunar orbit was one of the most skillful and least appreciated parts of the entire mission. It was a quiet, 4-hour chase through the vacuum. Collins, in the more powerful command module, performed most of the major engine burns to bring Columbia closer to the Eagle. Armstrong and Aldrin, in their smaller, more agile lander, performed the fine-tuning maneuvers. They used their radar systems to lock onto each other, and they made visual observations through their windows, calling out angles and closing speeds. It was a perfect execution of the orbital mechanics that Buzz Aldrin had written his doctoral thesis on years before. Finally, after several orbits of careful adjustments, the two spacecraft were flying in perfect formation, just a few meters apart. Collins looked out his window and saw the strange insect-like shape of the Eagle, with its scorch marks from the landing, floating serenely against the blackness of space. He then gently, skillfully nudged the nose of Columbia into the docking port on the roof of the Eagle. A series of latches engaged, and with a quiet, solid thud, the two ships were one again. The crew was reunited. The hatch between the two vehicles was opened, and Armstrong and Aldrin, grinning and exhausted, floated back into the relative comfort of the command module. They brought with them their precious cargo, the boxes of moon rocks and the film from their cameras. The mission's primary objective was now complete. They no longer had any use for their faithful lifeboat, the Eagle. After transferring all the essential items, they sealed the hatch for the final time. The lunar module was jettisoned, sent into a decaying orbit that would eventually cause it to crash back onto the lunar surface, its historic job done. The three astronauts were now together again in Columbia, their home for the 3-day journey back to Earth.
With the crew safely back in the command module, it was time to leave the moon's gravity behind. They fired their main engine one last time for a maneuver called the trans-Earth injection. This powerful 2.5-minute burn accelerated their spacecraft out of lunar orbit and placed them on a precise trajectory for home. The journey back was, in many ways, a mirror image of the trip out. A long, quiet, 3-day coast through the vast emptiness of space. But the mood inside the capsule was completely different. The tension of the outward journey and the landing was gone, replaced by a sense of tired, quiet triumph. They had done it! They had walked on the moon and were on their way back. The trip home was a time for them to rest, to eat, and to reflect on their incredible experience. They held one final television broadcast from space, showing the viewers back on Earth stunning, high-quality color images of the moon receding behind them, and the beautiful blue and white globe of Earth growing ever larger in their window. They tried their best to describe what they had seen and felt, but words seemed inadequate. They spoke of the profound perspective that the journey had given them, of seeing our world as a single, fragile oasis of life in a vast, dark desert. Their quiet, thoughtful reflections were broadcast to a world that was still in awe of their achievement. As they neared Earth, they prepared for the final, fiery act of their mission. They separated from the large cylindrical service module, the part of the spacecraft that contained their main engine and life support systems. For the first time, they could see the catastrophic damage from the explosion that had happened to Apollo 13's sister ship. They jettisoned it, sending it to burn up in the atmosphere. Only the small, cone-shaped command module, protected by its vital heat shield, would make the final descent.
The re-entry into Earth's atmosphere is a process of incredible violence and precision. The capsule hits the upper layers of the air, traveling at a blistering speed of nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, or about 25,000 miles per hour. It has to hit the atmosphere at a very precise angle, within a corridor only about 2 degrees wide. If the angle is too steep, the G-forces will be too high for the crew to survive. If the angle is too shallow, the capsule will act like a skipping stone, bouncing off the top of the atmosphere and back out into space, with no way to get back. The Apollo 11 crew, guided by their onboard computer, nailed the entry angle perfectly. As their capsule plowed into the air, the immense friction and compression created a fireball of superheated plasma outside their windows. The temperature on the surface of their heat shield soared to over 2,700 degrees Celsius, hotter than molten lava. The astronauts were pushed back into their seats by G-forces of up to 6 Gs. For about 3 long minutes, the ionized plasma around the capsule formed a sheath that blocked all radio signals, creating a tense period of communications blackout. The entire world waited in silence for them to emerge from the flames. And then the signal came through. The capsule had survived. At an altitude of about 7,000 meters, a series of small drogue parachutes deployed to stabilize the capsule. Then, at about 3,000 meters, the 3 enormous, iconic red and white main parachutes deployed, slowing their descent to a gentle splashdown. On July 24, 1969, 8 days, 3 hours, and 18 minutes after they had left Florida, the crew of Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, right on target, just a few miles from the recovery ship, the USS Hornet. The journey was over. They were home.
But their mission wasn't quite over yet. Even after being plucked from the ocean by Navy divers, the astronauts couldn't just get a handshake and the hero's welcome. They had to be immediately placed into quarantine. This was a very serious concern at the time. No one knew for sure if the moon might harbor some kind of unknown extraterrestrial microorganisms, moon germs, that could be harmless to the astronauts but could cause a devastating plague if unleashed on Earth. So NASA, working with the Public Health Service, had put in place a set of incredibly strict quarantine procedures. The moment the capsule's hatch was opened at sea, a recovery diver passed the astronauts 3 biological isolation garments. These were bulky, all-in-one suits with their own breathing apparatus that the astronauts had to put on before they could leave the capsule. This was to ensure that they didn't contaminate the ship's air. They were then transported by helicopter to the recovery ship, the USS Hornet. But instead of being taken to a hero's reception, they were immediately ushered into a specially designed sealed trailer called the Mobile Quarantine Facility, or MQF. This MQF was, essentially, a converted Airstream trailer, a small, self-contained apartment with sleeping quarters, a small lounge, and a medical station, all designed to be biologically isolated from the outside world. The astronauts would have to spend the next 21 days in this trailer, along with a flight surgeon and an engineer. Their first interactions with the world, including a welcome from President Nixon, who was on board the ship, were done through a sealed glass window. It must have been a strange and deeply anticlimactic experience. To have just returned from walking on the moon,
only to be immediately confined to a small trailer for 3 weeks, treated as if you were biologically hazardous. The fear of moon germs was taken very, very seriously.
The quarantine period continued even after the USS Hornet reached Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The entire mobile quarantine facility was offloaded from the ship and flown on a giant cargo plane back to a special lab in Houston, the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. The astronauts spent the remainder of their 21 days inside this lab, undergoing extensive medical tests. At the same time, the precious cargo they had brought back, the boxes of moon rocks, were also being handled with extreme care. They were kept in a sealed vacuum chamber and were initially handled only with remote-controlled robotic arms or through heavy-duty gloves built into the chamber walls, much like one would handle a deadly virus. Scientists wanted to see if the lunar material contained any signs of life, or if it had any strange effects on terrestrial life. They exposed small amounts of the moon dust to plants and animals to see what would happen. Of course, after weeks of intense study, they found nothing. The moon, as expected, was a completely sterile, lifeless world. There were no moon germs. The astronauts were perfectly healthy. After 21 days, they were finally released from quarantine to a waiting world ready to receive their long-overdue hero's welcome. This intense quarantine procedure was repeated for the Apollo 12 and Apollo 14 missions. But by the time of Apollo 15, the scientific community was confident that the moon was sterile, and the strict quarantine protocols were finally dropped. The astronauts of the later missions were able to have a much more normal and immediate homecoming. But the story of the first quarantine is a quiet reminder of the great unknowns that the first lunar explorers faced. They weren't just worried about the rocket or the landing. They were also venturing into a completely unknown biological frontier.
With the astronauts finally free and celebrated as global heroes, the quiet, long-term work of the Apollo program was just beginning. The true legacy of the missions was not just in the footprints on the flags, but in the treasure trove of scientific knowledge they brought back with them. The 382 kilograms of moon rocks are, to this day, one of the most valuable scientific collections on the planet. These rocks were not just souvenirs, they were pieces of another world, perfectly preserved in the vacuum of space for billions of years, a pristine record of the solar system's history. These rocks were distributed to scientific laboratories all over the world, allowing thousands of scientists from many different nations to participate in the discovery. And what did we learn from them? First, we were able to determine the exact age of the moon. By measuring the radioactive decay of elements within the rocks, we found that the moon formed about 4.5 billion years ago, at the same time as the Earth. We also learned what the moon is made of. The rocks from the dark lunar seas were volcanic basalts, similar to what we find on Earth's ocean floors. The rocks from the bright highlands were a lighter, less dense type of rock called anorthosite. This chemical composition was a huge clue to the moon's origin. The lunar rocks were very similar to the rocks in Earth's own mantle, but they were almost completely devoid of water and other volatile elements. This lent huge support to what is now the leading theory of the moon's formation, the giant impact hypothesis. This is the idea that a giant planet, nicknamed Theia, slammed into the very young Earth. The catastrophic collision blasted a huge amount of molten rock from both bodies into orbit, which then coalesced to form our moon. The intense heat of this event would have boiled away all the water, explaining why the moon is so dry. The moon rocks were the key piece of evidence that allowed us to solve the long-standing mystery of where our moon came from.
The moon rocks also allowed us to read the history of the solar system itself.
By dating the rocks from different craters, we were able to create a precise timeline of the late heavy bombardment, that violent period in the early solar system about 4 billion years ago when the inner planets were constantly being peppered by large asteroids and comets. The Moon, with no atmosphere or plate tectonics to erase its old craters, has preserved a perfect record of this chaotic era. Beyond the geology, the Apollo program had a massive, though sometimes subtle, impact on technology back here on Earth. The need to solve incredibly complex and unprecedented engineering problems with the technology of the 1960s spurred a wave of innovation across dozens of industries. This Apollo effect is one of the most important, if often overlooked, legacies of the race to the Moon. We've already talked about the most famous example, the Apollo guidance computer. Its development and its use of integrated circuits essentially kickstarted the microchip revolution, paving the way for the personal computers and smartphones we use today. The software engineering principles developed by Margaret Hamilton's team, with their focus on reliability and priority scheduling, became the foundation of modern, ultra-reliable software design. But the spin-offs went far beyond computing. The need for new, lightweight, and incredibly strong materials for the spacecraft led to advancements in materials science. The need to keep astronauts safe and healthy led to new developments in medical monitoring. The wireless headsets that the astronauts used were a major step forward in communications technology. The need for safe, reliable food led to the HACCP food safety system, which is now the global standard for the entire food industry. The list of quiet, incremental innovations that came from the immense challenge of the Apollo program is almost endless.
Contrary to popular myth, Teflon, Velcro, and Tang were not invented by NASA, but they were all adopted and popularized by the space program. The quiet, relentless push to solve the thousands of small problems involved in going to the Moon had a ripple effect that helped to shape the modern technological world we live in today. And then there is the human legacy. The image of the Earth seen from the Moon, that pale blue dot, became an icon for the environmental movement. It gave humanity a new perspective on our own planet, showing it as a single, beautiful, and fragile oasis of life in the vast emptiness of space. It was a powerful and unifying image. And for a generation, the Apollo program was a source of immense inspiration. It was a testament to the idea that with enough dedication, ingenuity, and political will, humanity could achieve almost anything it set its mind to. It inspired countless young people to pursue careers in science, engineering, and technology. But the golden age of Apollo was surprisingly brief. After the triumph of Apollo 11, there were 5 more successful moon landings. The later missions, from Apollo 15 onwards, were much more scientifically ambitious, with longer stays on the surface and the introduction of the lunar roving vehicle, the moon buggy, which allowed the astronauts to explore for miles. But back on Earth, public interest began to wane. The space race had been won. The missions were incredibly expensive, and with the ongoing Vietnam War and social unrest at home, the political will to continue the program faded. The final Apollo mission to the Moon was Apollo 17 in December of 1972. The commander, Gene Cernan, was the last man to walk on the Moon. As he prepared to climb the ladder of the lunar module for the final time, he spoke these final, poignant words from the lunar surface. "As we leave the Moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Since that day, no human has returned. The silence came back to the moon.
Let's drift back for a moment and spend more time with the machine that started it all, the Saturn V. We've talked about its immense power, but its structure was just as incredible. It was a 3-stage rocket, and each stage was a massive, powerful vehicle in its own right, built by different aerospace companies in different parts of the country and brought together in Florida for the final assembly. The first stage, the SIC, was built by Boeing. Its only job was to get the entire rocket off the ground and through the thickest part of the atmosphere. It was the brute force stage. It fired for only about 2.5 minutes, but in that time, it lifted the entire 3,000-ton vehicle to an altitude of over 67 kilometers and a speed of nearly 10,000 kilometers per hour. After its fuel was spent, it would detach and fall back into the Atlantic Ocean. Then, the second stage, the S2, would ignite. This stage was built by North American Aviation and was powered by 5 smaller but still incredibly powerful J2 engines. What was special about the S2 stage was its fuel. It burned liquid hydrogen, which is the most efficient and powerful rocket fuel we know of, but it is also incredibly difficult to handle. Liquid hydrogen has to be kept at a temperature of minus 253 degrees Celsius, just a few degrees above absolute zero. The engineering required to build a fuel tank that could hold this super cold liquid was immense. The S2 stage would fire for about 6 minutes, pushing the remaining spacecraft almost all the way to orbit. Finally, the third stage, the S4B, built by Douglas Aircraft, would take over. It had a single J2 engine. It would fire briefly to place the Apollo spacecraft into a temporary parking orbit around the Earth. Then, after all the systems were checked, it would fire again for about 6 minutes. This was the critical translunar injection burn, the final push that would accelerate the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and send it on its 3-day coast to the moon. It is a quiet testament to the incredible complexity of the mission that it required a 3-story tall rocket just to send a tiny capsule the size of a large car to our nearest neighbor.
Let's also spend more time with the Apollo guidance computer and its remarkable software. The fact that Margaret Hamilton's team designed the software with priority scheduling was not just a clever feature, it was a fundamental shift in how people thought about software reliability. At the time, most computer programs were simple, linear batch processes. They just ran one command after another. The idea of a computer that could multitask, that could recognize that it was overloaded, and that could intelligently decide to drop less important tasks to focus on mission-critical ones was revolutionary. During the final minutes of the Apollo 11 landing, this is exactly what happened. The computer was trying to do 2 things at once: run the complex calculations needed to guide the landing, and process the extra unnecessary data from the rendezvous radar that had been accidentally left on. This caused the computer's processing cycle to take too long, triggering the 1201 and 1202 alarms, which essentially meant, "I'm too busy, I have too much to do." A lesser software design would have simply crashed or frozen or entered an endless loop, which would have forced Armstrong to abort the landing. But the Apollo software did exactly what it was designed to do. It recognized the overload, it dropped the low-priority radar tasks, it rebooted itself, and it continued to perform the high-priority landing calculations without missing a beat. Down in Mission Control, it was a young 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales who had to make the final call. He had seen this exact alarm come up in a training simulation just a few weeks earlier, and because of that training, he knew what it meant. He knew the computer was designed to handle it. He trusted the software. So, in a moment of immense pressure, he made the calm, quiet, and correct call: go.
He told the flight director they were go on that alarm, and the landing continued. It was a victory not just for the pilots, but for the quiet, invisible genius of the software engineers back on Earth.
Let's now quietly reconsider the spacesuit, our personal spacecraft. The story of its creation by the company Playtex is a fascinating one. In the early 1960s, NASA invited aerospace and military contractors to submit their designs for the Apollo spacesuit. But they also invited Playtex, the company best known for making the cross-your-heart bra because of their expertise in making flexible rubber garments. The established aerospace companies approached the problem like they were building a piece of hardware. Their prototypes were stiff, heavy, and used metal joints, almost like a suit of armor. The Playtex engineers, on the other hand, approached it like they were making a piece of clothing. Their team was made up of expert seamstresses and designers who understood how to create a garment that could move with the human body. They used layers of flexible fabric and rubber, and their suit was much softer, more comfortable, and more reliable. In the initial competition, the Playtex design was rejected in favor of the more traditional aerospace contractor designs. But their prototype had so impressed some of the NASA engineers that they continued to work on it in secret. When the official designs kept failing their tests, they were too bulky, too heavy, and they kept breaking, the Playtex design was given a second chance. This time, it won. It was a quiet triumph of a completely different way of thinking. It showed that sometimes the best solution to a complex engineering problem comes not from the usual experts, but from a completely different field with a fresh perspective. The suit that walked on the moon had its origins not in a machine shop, but on a sewing machine. The helmet was another marvel. It was a fishbowl design, a single piece of impact-resistant polycarbonate, providing an incredibly wide field of view. And over this, the astronauts would attach a special visor assembly. This assembly had two visors. The inner one was a protective visor, and the outer one was coated with a thin layer of pure gold. This gold coating was essential. It was designed to reflect the sun's intense, unfiltered radiation, including the harmful ultraviolet and infrared rays, protecting the astronauts' eyes and keeping their head cool. So the iconic golden visor of an Apollo astronaut wasn't just for style. It was a critical piece of their personal cooling system.
Let's take one more look at the human element and the quiet stories of the men who flew the later missions. The focus is always on Apollo 11, but the 5 missions that followed were, in many ways, much more ambitious and scientifically productive. Take the crew of Apollo 12, the second landing. The commander was Pete Conrad, a famously lighthearted and witty astronaut. His first words upon stepping onto the lunar surface were a perfect reflection of his personality. Knowing that Neil Armstrong's one small step line was historic and profound, Conrad, who was much shorter than Armstrong, decided to say something a little more personal. As he stepped off the ladder, he exclaimed, "Whoopee! Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." It was a funny, self-deprecating, and wonderfully human start to his exploration. One of the main goals of the Apollo 12 mission was to make a pinpoint landing right next to an old unmanned probe called Surveyor 3, which had landed on the moon 2 years earlier. They landed perfectly, just a short walk away. The astronauts then walked over to the Surveyor probe and retrieved some of its parts, including its camera, to bring back to Earth so scientists could study the effects of the lunar environment on man-made materials. But this led to a fascinating and slightly alarming discovery. When scientists analyzed the camera back on Earth, they found a small colony of common Earth bacteria, Streptococcus mitis, that was still alive inside it. It had survived 2.5 years in the vacuum, the cold, and the radiation of the moon. This was a quiet, startling lesson in the resilience of life, and it reinforced why the quarantine procedures for the early missions were taken so seriously. It also meant that technically, The first contamination of another world with Earth life was done completely by accident.
The later Apollo missions, from 15 onwards, were even more ambitious. These were the J missions, and they carried a new and incredible piece of hardware, the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or LRV. This was the moon buggy. It was a marvel of minimalist engineering. It was an electric car with wheels made of a woven mesh of zinc-coated piano wire instead of rubber tires. To fit inside the cramped lunar module, it was designed to be folded up like a tiny transformer and then unfolded by the astronauts on the lunar surface. The LRV completely changed the nature of lunar exploration. The Apollo 11 astronauts were limited to walking just a few dozen yards from their lander. But with the LRV, the later crews could travel for miles across the lunar surface, exploring a much wider variety of geological features, like mountains and vast canyons called rills. They could go on long, multi-hour road trips, acting as true field geologists. The driving experience was purportedly bizarre and bouncy. In the low 1/6 gravity, the rover would bounce and float over the bumpy terrain. The astronauts described it as being like driving on a trampoline. The dust kicked up by the wheels was also a major problem. Because there was no air, the dust would fly up in perfect rooster-tail-shaped arcs and then fall back down, covering everything: the rover, the suits, the equipment, in a fine abrasive layer. And for a final obscure fact about this amazing machine, the navigation system on the LRV was surprisingly low-tech. It didn't have GPS, of course. It had a simple directional gyro and an odometer on the wheels that measured the distance traveled. From this, a small computer would calculate their direction and distance back to the lunar module. It was a quiet, simple, and incredibly reliable system that ensured the explorers on another world could always find their way home.
Let's now revisit the legacy of the mission and the quiet truth about the moon rocks. We know they taught us about the origin and age of the moon, but they also taught us about the history of our sun. The lunar soil, or regolith, has been sitting on the surface, undisturbed by weather or geological activity, for billions of years. It has been constantly bombarded by the solar wind, that stream of particles from our sun. This means that the lunar soil has trapped a perfect record of the sun's activity over its entire lifetime. By analyzing the gases and isotopes embedded in the moon dust, we can learn about how our sun has changed over time. The moon rocks are not just rocks, they are a pristine, ancient scroll on which the history of our own star is written. And what about the fate of all this precious material? Of the 382 kilograms brought back, the vast majority is still carefully preserved at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. It is stored in a secure, nitrogen-filled vault to protect it from contamination by Earth's atmosphere and moisture. Small samples are still being studied by scientists today, and many samples have been deliberately kept sealed and untouched, waiting for a future generation of scientists with more advanced technology and new questions to ask. The scientific gift of the Apollo missions is one that will continue to give for centuries to come. But there is one final, quiet legacy of the Apollo program that is often forgotten. The 3 empty colossal stages of each Saturn V rocket that launched a mission to the moon are still out there. The first stages are all at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, but the powerful third stages, the S-4Bs, that fired to push the astronauts on their way to the moon, were sent on a variety of different paths. Some were deliberately crashed into the moon to create artificial moonquakes for the seismometers to detect. Others were sent into orbit around the sun, where they continue to drift as man-made asteroids to this day.
And one, the third stage from the Apollo 12 mission, is in a strange, chaotic orbit around both the Earth and the Moon. It is a large, quiet, and lonely piece of space junk, a ghost of the Apollo program, still dancing in the gravity of the worlds it helped us to reach.
Our next story takes us to Christmas of 1968 and the mission of Apollo 8. This mission, in many ways, was even more daring and more risky than the first landing would be. It was the first time in history that human beings had ever left the gravitational embrace of the Earth. They were the first to ride the colossal Saturn V rocket and the first to travel all the way to another celestial body. Their mission was simple but profound: to orbit the Moon and come back safely. The crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, were the first humans to see the far side of the Moon with their own eyes. They were the first to see the Earth as a whole planet, a distant blue marble. And on their fourth orbit, as their capsule came around from the silent far side, a breathtaking sight came into view in their window. It was the Earth rising over the barren gray horizon of the Moon. This was the first Earthrise ever witnessed by human eyes. The astronauts were stunned by the beauty of the moment. They scrambled for a camera. William Anders took the now iconic photograph, a stunning image of our vibrant, colorful, living world hanging in the black, sterile emptiness above the dead lunar landscape. The photograph became one of the most important and influential images in human history. It was a powerful symbol for the environmental movement, a quiet, profound reminder of the beauty and fragility of our own home. On Christmas Eve, the crew held a live television broadcast from lunar orbit. They showed the viewers back on Earth the incredible images of the Moon passing below them. And as they concluded their broadcast, they chose to read a message. They read the first 10 verses from the book of Genesis, the story of creation. It was a moment of quiet awe and reflection that was broadcast to a huge global audience. They ended with the words, "Good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth." It was a message of peace and unity sent from another world.
From the poetic first journey, we now move to the final dress rehearsal. This is the story of Apollo 10, which flew in May of 1969, just 2 months before the historic landing. The mission of Apollo 10 was to do everything that Apollo 11 would do, except for the actual landing itself. It was a full-up test of all the hardware and all the procedures in the lunar environment. The crew, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan, flew their command module, which they had nicknamed Charlie Brown, to the Moon. Once in lunar orbit, Stafford and Cernan moved into their lunar module, which they had given the wonderful call sign Snoopy. They then separated from Charlie Brown and began their descent. They flew Snoopy all the way down to an altitude of just 9 miles, or about 15 kilometers, above the lunar surface. They were so close they could see the details of the craters and mountains with incredible clarity. They were scouting the future landing site for Apollo 11. During their descent, they had their own moment of quiet terror. As they prepared to jettison the descent stage and fire their Ascent Engine to return to orbit, their little spacecraft suddenly went into a wild, uncontrollable spin. The astronauts were thrown around the cabin as the lander tumbled through the lunar sky. For a few tense moments, they were in serious trouble. They quickly figured out the problem. A switch had been left in the wrong position, and they managed to regain control. It was a critical lesson that helped ensure the same mistake wouldn't be made on Apollo 11. And it was on this mission that the crew famously heard that strange, ethereal space music while they were out of radio contact on the far side of the moon. The recently declassified transcripts capture their genuine confusion and wonder. "Do you hear that?" one asks. "That whistling sound. Boy, that's weird music." They were so baffled by it, they debated whether to even tell NASA about it, fearing they wouldn't be believed. It was, as we now know, just radio interference. But it adds a layer of quiet human mystery to their incredible journey.
Let's jump forward now, past the triumph of Apollo 11, to the mission that followed it. Apollo 12, which launched in November of 1969, had its own moment of extreme drama, and it happened just seconds after liftoff. It was a cloudy, rainy day at the Kennedy Space Center. 36 seconds after the Saturn V rocket cleared the tower, the entire vehicle was struck by lightning. A massive bolt of lightning traveled down the ionized plume of the rocket's exhaust, temporarily shorting out the spacecraft's entire electrical system. Inside the command module, the cockpit was suddenly filled with a cascade of red and yellow warning lights. The astronauts' control panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Their navigation system went haywire, and the telemetry link to mission control was lost. They were flying into space in a dead spacecraft with no idea which way they were pointing. For a moment, it seemed like the mission would have to be aborted. But down in mission control, a young 24-year-old engineer named John Aaron remembered a strange, obscure system failure he had seen in a training simulation a year earlier. He calmly made a suggestion over the radio loop. "Flight, try SCE to aux." He was referring to a deeply obscure switch on the control panel, the signal conditioning equipment switch. Most of the astronauts, including the mission commander Pete Conrad, had no idea what he was talking about. But one astronaut, Alan Bean, the lunar module pilot, remembered the switch from his own training. He reached up, found the switch, and flipped it to the auxiliary position, and instantly everything came back online. The telemetry link was restored, the navigation system reset, and the mission was saved. It was a quiet, incredible moment of a single brilliant mind on the ground, remembering a single obscure detail that saved the entire mission from failure. The crew of Apollo 12 went on to make a perfect pinpoint landing on the moon, right next to the unmanned Surveyor 3 probe.
Now let's talk about the crew of Apollo 14, who flew to the moon in 1971. The commander of this mission was none other than Alan Shepard, the very first American to ever fly in space. After his historic suborbital Mercury flight in 1961, Shepard was grounded by an inner ear disorder that caused severe dizziness. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as his fellow astronauts flew in the Gemini and early Apollo missions. It was a deeply frustrating time for the intensely competitive pilot. But after undergoing a risky experimental surgery, his condition was cured. And in a remarkable comeback story, he was assigned to command the Apollo 14 mission. At the age of 47, he would finally get his chance to walk on the moon. He became the oldest person to ever walk on the lunar surface, and the only one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts to do so. His mission was a huge success, but it is perhaps best remembered for a small, slightly mischievous act at the end of his last moonwalk. Shepard had brought with him, hidden in his suit, a specially modified 6-iron golf club head and a couple of golf balls. In the low gravity of the moon, he attached the club head to the handle of a geology tool, dropped the balls onto the dusty surface, and took a few swings. Because the spacesuit was so stiff, he could only swing with one hand, and his first couple of attempts were shanks that just dug into the lunar dust.
but he finally made contact with one. He famously exclaimed, "Miles and miles and miles." In reality, the low gravity and lack of air resistance probably sent the ball flying for a few hundred yards. It was a light-hearted, joyful moment, a quiet symbol of the human desire to play, even in the most alien of environments. It was a beautiful, personal grace note to his incredible career.
The final 3 Apollo missions, 15, 16, and 17, were known as the J missions, and they represented the peak of lunar exploration. These missions were much more scientifically focused and featured longer stays on the surface, more extensive moonwalks, and the incredible addition of the lunar roving vehicle, the moon buggy. The LRV was an engineering marvel. It was an electric car with wheels made not of rubber, but of a woven mesh of zinc-coated piano wire. The whole thing was designed to be folded up like a clever piece of origami and stowed in a small compartment on the side of the lunar module. Unpacking it on the lunar surface was a complex procedure involving pulling on a series of ropes and pulleys, but it always worked flawlessly. The rover completely changed the nature of lunar exploration. Instead of being limited to walking a few hundred yards from their lander, the astronauts could now travel for miles across the lunar landscape. They became true field geologists, able to drive to distant mountains, canyons, and craters to collect a much wider variety of rock samples. They were no longer just visitors. They were explorers in the truest sense of the word. One of the most famous discoveries made possible by the rover was on the Apollo 15 mission. The astronauts, David Scott and James Irwin, drove to the edge of a great canyon called Hadley Raleigh. There, they found a small, white rock that was unlike anything they had seen before. It was a piece of anorthosite, a type of rock that is thought to have formed the original primordial crust of the moon. This rock, nicknamed the Genesis Rock, was over 4 billion years old, a pristine sample from the very birth of the moon. It was one of the most important scientific discoveries of the entire Apollo program, and it was only possible because they had a car on the moon.
The final mission to the moon, Apollo 17, in December of 1972, was special for another reason. For the first and only time, the crew included a professional scientist, a geologist named Harrison Jack Schmitt. While all the other moonwalkers were test pilots who had been given a crash course in geology, Schmitt was a geologist who had been given a crash course in how to be an astronaut. His presence on the mission was a huge boon for the scientific community. His trained eye allowed him to spot interesting features and rocks that a non-specialist might have missed. The most famous moment of his exploration came when he suddenly shouted with excitement, "Oh my gosh, there is orange soil!" He had stumbled upon a patch of strange bright orange soil near the rim of a crater. This orange soil turned out to be tiny beads of volcanic glass that had been erupted from a fire fountain deep within the moon's interior billions of years ago. It was another stunning discovery, a window into the moon's ancient fiery past. But the story of Apollo 17 is also a little sad because it was the end. The commander of the mission, Eugene Cernan, was the 11th man to walk on the moon. His pilot, Harrison Schmitt, was the 12th. As Cernan prepared to climb the ladder of the lunar module for the very last time, he became the final human being to stand on the surface of another world. He paused and spoke these final poignant words, a quiet farewell to the moon on behalf of all humanity. As we leave the moon at Taurus Latro, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. As I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future,
I'd like to just say what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon, we leave you with a challenge and a hope. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17. Since that day, no human has returned.
Now, let's take a final quiet detour into the other side of the space race. While the Apollo program was making its historic journeys, the Soviet Union had its own highly secret program to land a man on the moon. And at the heart of their effort was a rocket of truly colossal proportions, a machine designed to rival the American Saturn V. This was the N-1 rocket. The N-1 was a behemoth. It was slightly shorter than the Saturn V, but it was wider and, in some ways, even more complex. Its first stage was powered by an incredible 30 individual rocket engines arranged in 2 concentric rings. This incredibly complex design was, in part, a result of internal rivalries. The Soviet Union's most powerful rocket engine designer, Valentin Glushko, refused to work with the chief designer, Sergei Korolev, on the project. This forced Korolev to rely on a different designer, Nikolai Kuznetsov, who made smaller, less powerful engines. To get the necessary thrust, Korolev had no choice but to simply use a huge number of them. This made the N-1 an engineer's nightmare. The plumbing required to feed fuel to 30 engines was immensely complex, and the control systems needed to keep all of them firing perfectly in unison were pushing the limits of the technology at the time. The development of the N-1 was rushed, underfunded, and plagued by the political infighting that followed Korolev's sudden death in 1966. Between 1969 and 1972, the Soviets launched the N-1 rocket 4 times from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and every single launch ended in a catastrophic failure. The first flight failed after about a minute when a fire broke out in the engine section. The second launch, just a few months later, was the most spectacular disaster of all. Immediately after liftoff, a loose bolt was ingested into a fuel pump, causing one of the 30 engines to shut down. The rocket's control system tried to compensate, but it shut down the wrong engines and the rocket fell back onto the launch pad. The resulting explosion was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history, completely destroying the launch complex and setting back the program for years.
The final 2 test flights of the N-1 in 1971 and 1972 also ended in failure, with the rocket exploding before ever reaching orbit. After these 4 catastrophic failures, and with the Americans having already successfully landed on the moon multiple times, the Soviet lunar program was quietly canceled in 1974. The entire project was classified as top secret, and its existence was denied by the Soviet Union for decades. The story of the N-1 is a quiet, cautionary tale about the immense difficulty of space exploration. It's a reminder that even for a superpower, the journey to the moon was not guaranteed. It required not just ambition, but also a little bit of luck, and perhaps the singular genius of a man like Wernher von Braun on the American side, and the tragic loss of a man like Sergei Korolev on the Soviet side. And so we've taken a long and winding journey through the quiet facts and hidden stories of the Apollo era. We have seen the incredible machines, the brilliant minds, and the quiet courage
that defined humanity's first age of lunar exploration. It was a brief, shining moment in our history, a time when we dared to leave our home planet and walk upon the surface of another world. The legacy of that time is all around us, in the technology we use, in our understanding of the solar system, and in the profound, beautiful image of our own fragile planet hanging in the void. It's a story that can feel like it belongs to a distant, almost mythical past, but it is also, we hope, a story of the future. And that brings us to our final quiet thought for the night. The journey to the moon did not end with Apollo 17. Right now, a new generation of engineers and scientists are working on NASA's Artemis program, named after the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology. Its goal is to return humans to the moon, this time to stay.
The Artemis program is building new rockets, like the Space Launch System, or SLS, which is even more powerful than the Saturn V. They have a new crew capsule called Orion, and they are planning to build a small space station in orbit around the moon, called the Gateway, which will serve as a staging point for missions down to the lunar surface. The goal is not just to plant flags and leave footprints, but to build a sustainable, long-term human presence on the moon. They plan to land the first woman and the next man near the lunar South Pole, a region that is rich in water ice and could be a vital resource for future lunar bases. This return to the moon is not just about reliving the glories of the past. It is about building a foundation for the future. The technologies we will develop for living and working on the moon, from mining water ice to building habitats and recycling life support, are the very same technologies we will need for our next great leap, a human mission to Mars. The moon is a crucial, quiet stepping stone on our long journey outwards into the solar system. So the story of the moon landing is not over. We are living in the quiet intermission between the first act and the second. The footprints that have sat undisturbed in the lunar dust for over 50 years will, we hope, soon be joined by new ones. A new generation will get to look up from the lunar surface and see that beautiful, distant blue and white marble of home. And that is a wonderful and hopeful thought to end on. The quiet story of exploration is a continuous one. It is a story of patient, dedicated work, of standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before, and of always, always looking to the next horizon. So as you get ready to drift off to sleep, let these quiet stories be a comforting presence. Think of the immense, coordinated effort, the quiet courage, and the brilliant ingenuity it took to achieve these incredible feats. And think of the future, of the new journeys that are just beginning. Sweet dreams.